there was some sort of switch or decision in their mind that like these people don't deserve empathy because they are part of the oppressor.
I don't want to demand empathy. I want them to feel empathy for my people without me having to make the case for it. Hey everyone, I'm Sally Abid.
And I'm Jess Bricker.
And this is The Long Answer,
a deep dive into the hardest questions around Israel-Palestine. Just before we get into this episode, we wanted to say that this was recorded before Trump's 20-point plan, so we don't make reference to the plan in this episode, but the topics we delve into are just as relevant.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Welcome to episode 2 of The Long Answer. We are recording this on a really, really difficult morning. We just woke up to the news of really, really intensive bombings in Gaza last night, in Gaza City. Bombs that could be heard from Tel Aviv last night. And that's sort of the place that we're in. We don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks before this episode airs, but that's where we're at. And that's where we're bringing you this conversation from.
When you said they started, it means the invasion of Gaza, the city of Gaza, where a huge number of people who are displaced already are there in tents without shelter, barely any food, who have to be displaced again.
And on top of all this and like the actual daily reality, we're also kind of gearing up soon to, I guess, mark 2 years since October 7th, which, you know, for some people is a memorial day that marks this horrible, horrible day with this attack. For a lot of people, this marks 2 years of genocide. It marks, for some people, 2 years of war. It marks 2 years of hostages being in captivity.
And then, you know, obviously, the people in Gaza are reaching 2 years of unimaginable reality, and they don't know when it's going to end.
For a lot of people, both here and abroad, our lives have looked incredibly different since that day. And I think when I think about like these kind of different lenses that we're all viewing it from, I think about this conversation I had recently when I was giving a talk to a group of people abroad. And I at some point made a comment that, you know, we've all been witnessing the worst thing we've ever seen in our lives through our phones for 2 years. And I was talking about what's happening in Gaza. And one of the participants at the end of the call kind of called me out on that and said, you know, I was really taken aback when you said that you've been witnessing the worst thing you've ever seen for 2 years on your phone, because for me, the worst thing I've ever seen was October 7th. And I think that my like very genuine kind of first impression or first thought when I heard that was how, and I don't mean to belittle the things that happened on October 7th. I think, you know, I've seen the images, I've read the stories, I've heard the testimonies, I've spoken to friends who have lost loved ones, and it was horrific. You know, those images were horrible, and we saw them in real time as it was happening. But for me, I was just like, I just feel like, you know, every day since, I've woken up to a video of a baby who had their head blown off, an entire family that was wiped out, the most horrific sort of annihilation of a people that I've ever seen. And I couldn't understand how anything, you know, from that day was worse than the collective 2 years that we've been experiencing. And then sort of right after that thought process, I was like, maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe I, as a Jew or as an Israeli, am supposed to, no matter what, perceive or believe or view my people's suffering and grief as worse than other people's. Like maybe I got it wrong, or maybe I mixed up empathy or mourning. And I think it really speaks volumes of sort of the different worlds that we're all living in, and the way in which we can all see the same thing, but tell ourselves a different story about it. And, you know, as we said, each episode we're going to be asking each other a personal question that sort of relates to these sort of topics that we want to delve into. And I think when I think about that conversation that I had, I think a lot about how it feels sort of like the world that you live in here in some way, where you are every day watching the worst thing that you've ever seen happen to your people happen. And anytime, I guess, you talk about it or mention it or acknowledge it, someone feels like you're telling them that the thing that happened to them was not that bad, or that you don't care about the thing that happened to them. And I kind of wanted to ask you, like, how do you see that? Like, how do you grapple with that experience in your day to day?
Yeah, thank you. Um, it's exhausting. It really is exhausting. I think Israeli society does expect me to prioritize its own trauma and its own grief and empathize with their people than mine. Like, I actually lost a friend over this already. Maybe she's listening to us.
Hi.
You know, when October 7th happened, I was like traumatized. I went to funerals all like the first couple of like weeks. I was like jumping between funerals and people and talking. Like, I was genuinely there in the trauma, like with everyone. And once I feel like things started really escalating in Gaza in a way that, like, okay, this is like a second Nakba. Like, that's it. We knew that like within a week, I feel. She just wasn't able to do the same for me. I don't think she had the ability to do that. I think it was much easier for her to justify Palestinian death than Jewish death. I think the minute I am Palestinian to them, I am provoking them. And I'm trying to kind of demand empathy. I don't want to demand empathy. I want them to feel empathy for my people without me having to make the case for it when it's personal. You know, when I talk as, a council member or, a public figure, talking to the collective, and then these backlashes are from like the media or from a journalist who's like interviewing me after being kicked out from the coalition, for talking about Gaza from the Haifa municipality. For anyone who doesn't know, I am an elected official. I always rationalize it. I always try to understand the challenges that I have to navigate. But it is almost like it's part of the job. It's part of the complexity of the mission. But for me, the most impossible mission is actually the personal one. It's difficult to navigate personal life in a mixed city, especially in Haifa.
I think that when a lot of people abroad look at like social media or the discourse around what's happening here, people are told like who they can and can't empathize with, and who you should empathize with based on power structures. Like I'll never forget, like I think it was literally like the day after October 7th, or very, very soon after, a friend of mine posted some Instagram story about the Nova Festival attack. And she said, like, she has no empathy for these, teenagers and young people that were murdered at this festival, for the hundreds of them that were murdered point blank at this festival, because they were at a festival next to a concentration camp. That was like the words of the post. And to me, looking at that, the person who posted this and the people who were posting this were young people who go to music festivals in countries where they do acknowledgement of country. They acknowledge that they themselves are settlers in the place that they're from as white people. But they looked at this and instantly had to not empathize with people who look the same as them, who probably have the same hobbies and interests as them. And almost there was some sort of switch or decision in their mind that these people don't deserve empathy because they are part of the oppressor, or because they're part of this ethno-nationalist state or whatever it is. And I think since then we keep seeing people choosing what they want to empathize with, or choosing how to perceive the situation based on what the rules that they feel apply to who gets to use force, who gets to be a victim of force, who doesn't get to use force, and who doesn't get to be a victim of force.
I think what we're looking at here is two main, sources of empathy. One that comes from ideology, from your collective narrative or the way that you view the event or the situation or the world. And there's empathy that comes from human interaction and from just empathizing with human pain because we are humans. And apparently those are really two different things and sometimes in conflict because we are prevented from empathizing with people, with human suffering because of ideology and narratives.
Right.
And that's why, especially in social media and the big discourse, looking at it from, the collective narratives and it's a very clear lens, almost synthetic. But when you're interacting with people, it can surprise you. It can be very unpredictable. It can be very irrational. It's not rational for me to sympathize with my neighbor's kid who's in Gaza right now.
As a soldier.
As a soldier. It's not rational, like for me to empathize with that. It's not rational for me to look.
I mean, I guess what does rational mean? Because it's rational in the sense that it performing empathy for him is rational in your sense of survival and having good relationships with neighbors, right? Maybe it's not rational on an emotional level that do you understand what I'm saying?
That's I do perform empathy sometimes. I have to perform empathy a lot of the times. Not because I don't feel it, but because they want it, they want it when they want it, right?
Yeah.
Even when I'm literally shattered, my soul is just crushed and I'm paralyzed with emotions. They want me to perform, But that's different than what I'm talking about. I think what I'm talking about is more actually, looking at a photo of a 19-year-old soldier who got killed in Gaza, and I'm like, oh fuck. Actually, my heart actually breaks for him and for his family and for his mom. It actually breaks, and that catches me by surprise. That I'm actually emotional. He shouldn't die.
I just feel if I was a Palestinian living in the diaspora somewhere, I don't know, in the US or somewhere else, and I heard you say that, I would have a really hard time with that. What would you, I guess, how do you...
Hard time with what?
With the fact that you just got emotional talking about an Israeli mother's son who is a soldier in Gaza dying.
And why is that hard to say?
I guess, I mean, not for me as me.
Yeah.
But me, if I was this character that I'm talking about, I think you're not supposed to. This guy is doing horrible things in Gaza. He's participating in a genocide. He might be one of these guys filming themselves and filming the explosions. He's doing all of this. How do you explain to someone the experience that you're having of being emotional at the thought of something bad happening to him?
Yeah. First of all, I did say it's irrational. So I'm not sure I can explain it other than the fact that I think a 19-year-old soldier is probably conducting war crimes. But I also need to think about that same soldier who didn't die and who came back to his family and became post-traumatic. They're real people. They are a product of a very cruel society. I expect the same complexity of empathy and compassion to Palestinians, Palestinian youth serving in Hamas right now. I would expect the same, kind of conversation.
Which I think a lot of people will find
also
hard
problematic.
to hear. Yeah, I think those two ideas I think are so sensitive.
Listen, it's sensitive for so many reasons. It's also problematic to put them in parallel for so many reasons, right? You are talking about a hegemonic, oppressive, occupying army and a soldier serving that army, and you're talking about a kid who's being starved, who's in siege, who's never, a 17-year-old who never left Gaza, was never allowed to, and you're not, we're not trying to excuse anything here, but you when you do draw these parallels and you do try to do that, you need to contextualize.
Yeah.
You need to contextualize. And there's no room for that context in Israel. There's no room for that context. I do think there should be room for it abroad, and we ought to bring it there. I do think we created a room for it in our movement and within our, activism and our culture of solidarity and mutual empathy.
I remember a few months into it, I think it was around December of 2023, and I had an argument with a friend because I didn't understand why the friend thought it was like controversial or weird to like just want a ceasefire, a complete ceasefire, for it to stop, hostage deal. And my friend said to me, well, I have friends that are fighting in Gaza. And I turned to him and I was like, okay, but I have friends that are Palestinian. And it was like these two things that were at odds with each other, because I was empathizing with this group, he was empathizing with that group. And, it sort of like stopped the conversation. And I was just like, what am I supposed to do here? Like, am I supposed to try and like find empathy from him? Or is he supposed to try and get empathy from me? Like, are we supposed to try and convince each other? Or are we supposed to kind of abandon that idea of convincing each other to be empathetic at all?
I think when there is this big gap, right? Then you're really looking at the tension and seemingly conflict, which I'm not sure is a conflict, between empathy and the conversation and, almost like politics, the narrative of empathy, and invoking that from people, demanding that from people, almost like it can be morally lecturing almost, it feels, and it just doesn't seem constructive, and between the politics of interest. And as organizers, as activists, we have to ask ourselves, would I rather have hundreds of thousands of people mobilized every week in Israel around the collective self-interest of the Israeli people, around the hostages, around security, around economic security and the economic cost that is happening? Or, instead of that, trying to evoke empathy towards the Palestinians or towards us, as people who are hurting in Israel, then I'd rather take the politics of interest. Not only rather, I dearly hold it ideologically as the way to go.
How would you explain why it is actually in Israeli self-interest?
That's exactly like the point. You talk to your friend in December, 2 months in, when we started talking about ceasefire, we actually started talking about a hostage deal. We didn't say ceasefire. I think ceasefire was like explosive. The first week was like, the first month was like explosive. It's like saying genocide right now for Israeli society. Ceasefire was there. I think people like don't understand that. They don't understand our relationship with the Israeli public. When we started saying hostage deal, the first week, we were polling at 0.1% of the public with us. Hostage deal. Today, it's, the majority of the people, over 74% consistently, right? If you really look at it, aggregate numbers, there are tens, if not like sometimes at the peak, hundreds of thousands of people who got mobilized every week in Israel. And the vast majority of them are there for the hostages. They're not there for Palestinian kids. It's not necessarily conflicted though. The case is we are closer to our goal than if we said, if you don't care about Palestinians, don't come out because you're a hypocrite. I do feel like if I'm demanding empathy, it will actually hurt my ability to mobilize them around our shared cause. We do agree that this war needs to end. It's just that their empathy is not in the same place as mine, but that's okay. We still have the same interests. And it's not instrumental. Of course, many of us represent, the Jewish interest to return the hostages. And it is very, very genuine self-interest.
I think that for us in our organizing, it's not that we believe that, it's just in people's self-interest to have empathy. It's in people's self-interest on a broader scale everywhere is to live with safety and like prosperity, be able to like put food on the table for their kids and not worry about what's going to happen the next day. And if we can acknowledge that, then we can understand, okay, what needs to happen here in Israel-Palestine is for there to be actual justice and peace and equality and security for everyone. And part of that, well, I'm actually not sure if we need people to feel empathetic towards each other to reach that place. But I think along the way, when we champion self-interest as like this thing that we're working with and that we mobilize people around, we do need at some point
You're right.
to develop empathy.
I actually agree with you. I don't think they need to feel empathetic. I think they just need to feel like it's a shared interest for both of them,
Right.
not to die and to live in security and
Right.
peace and equality. And that is different than empathy. However, there is a slight complication. 20% of Israeli society is Palestinian. And it's not just like this detached, like this, not
Right.
just like a neighbor that you want to like create, you know, we are so heavily integrated, and the vision is for us to be equally integrated. And I do think that at a certain point, the interest does become, you know, the culture of solidarity and compassion, which might be a little bit different than empathy, but it does create the culture of solidarity and compassion creates our ability. It changes the story, basically.
Yeah.
It changes the story, and then you're able to feel more empathy.
I think like I just want to circle back. We cop a lot of criticism from people abroad who say like, you keep talking about security, you keep talking about Israeli interests. And I think that what's, I don't know, kind of funny or ironic to me is a lot of self-interest abroad or in other communities that are not local. A lot of the self-interest is disguised almost. Like, I think even the way that you see how much power organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, or if not now, have managed to gain, and how much mobilization they've managed to do with the slogan "Not in my name." It's bringing Jews from abroad to this struggle and touching their self-interest, which is it not happening in their name. People, I think, perceive that as like, I want to be moral or I want to be empathetic and therefore I will join this fight. But under the surface is this thing of like, because I have an interest in not being connected to this thing. I have an interest in not being complicit in this thing. I think self-interest is a difficult concept for people who are not, I guess, faced with the daily reality of like insecurity or feeling unsafe. You know, while I think it's also actually like deeply grounded in people's self-interest for a lot of people to be moral or to like perform morality or empathy. I think that for people on the ground, for people in Gaza, for people everywhere on this land, their first and foremost, their self-interest is being safe and not being killed. I think that's the thing that we need to also like grapple with here, is that is the thing that people are thinking about. And whether you are actually under threat of being killed tomorrow because you're in Gaza, or whether you are
much further.
A much further away idea of being killed tomorrow, which, you know, a lot of Israelis feel. These are very different things, right? Those realities, completely different. One, it's happening in real time, could happen tomorrow. One is part of a larger story. But the way that these people feel can't be argued with. And that is the thing that they are thinking about first and foremost. And I think that's why we need to have this approach of self-interest and this focus on self-interest when we're trying to mobilize and organize people on the ground.
Honestly, if that's the case, if most people, you know, we said like we talked about limitation of empathy and like how, you know, abroad it's not like interactive or, you know, or more complex or doesn't, but obviously it mobilized so many people, right? Totally. It's like the Palestinian solidarity movement around the world. You know, I don't think any international, like any conflict, local conflict has ever maintained such a high level of prolonged mobilization for so long. And it does have to do with the level of atrocities, definitely. But I do think it has to do with, you know, what it represents. It represents, it's the epicenter of everything that's wrong with our societies and economics and world, you know, Middle East and West and, you know, energy and weapons and you know, colonization and imperialism and capitalism and all of these things. Like they all are intertwined in this little piece of land, you know, and it does represent all of that. I do think, however, that a lot of the problems and the toxic discourse abroad and the lack of empathy and the deep limitation of empathy, and therefore the narrow lens of the story that they're looking from is not out of self-interest, especially when you see a Palestinian from Israel abroad and you want to boycott her on a campus. You're a white girl with a hatta, with a kafiyya, and you are boycotting me because I'm talking about my self-interest, and I just happen to be within the Israeli society as a Palestinian. And the fact that you lacked empathy for me, we need a new kind of story that really understands and enables us to feel empathy for human pain without, weaponizing it and without cynically using human suffering for our own narrative.
I guess, like, what is this new story that we want to tell? Like, what do we think? Like, as we said, like, we're approaching this moment. We're coming up to this milestone. And there is 1,000,001 stories and narratives and ways that people are relating to this. And what do we want? I guess, what story do we want people to tell about this moment? What do we want our peoples to learn about this moment?
I think
that's why I asked you.
No, it's a difficult. I think this is something that we will talk about throughout the season.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is that it's a human pain and suffering that is,
I guess, human pain and suffering, while acknowledging power imbalances, while acknowledging history.
Contextualize, right? Without excusing. We are coming towards 2 years, and the Israeli government is cynically using this human pain while completely dehumanizing Palestinians, erasing them from the public discourse and from the land very violently. And we see parallel to that, parallel conversations to that on the other side. If you weren't able to empathize with Israeli hostages, the Israeli victims on October 7th, you are feeding into very, very dangerous and quickly spiraling narratives of very extreme, dark leaders and people with power who are going to be the end of us. Like, I honestly think leaning into that, lack of empathy really feeds those very, very toxic, dangerous narratives of zero, like kill or be killed. And that's extremely scary to me.
Right, and I think it works both ways in some sense, how every sort of lack of empathy feeds the other very dangerous narrative. Like, I think obviously lack of empathy for Palestinians is going to help the Israeli government keep doing what they're doing. But at the same time, I think that, like, this immense lack of empathy for Israelis and Israeli society also feeds that same thing. As long as Israelis feel like they are hated by everyone, that everyone's out to get them, as long as they feel that, they're going to keep justifying this stuff. Because when you feel unsafe and when you feel like everyone hates you, you're going to be like, well, I don't care about morals. I care about feeling safe.
Surviving.
Right. And
not even feeling safe.
Right. Literally just not dying.
Yeah.
And no matter how big or small the actual threat to your life is, your perceived threat is going to drive all of your behavior and is going to keep feeding back into these really dangerous leaders.
And obviously, when we talk about, having empathy in that sense, is we're not expecting anyone to, equalize or, they're both sides and both siding everything and saying,
like
no, like
it.
It's not flat. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. And of course, we see the immense inequality, of suffering, and of the power dynamic and the hegemony and the monopoly over violence and over moral violence. And we could talk about all of that, but like, we understand these complexes. But the moment that we start justifying while contextualizing and really ridding ourselves of our ability to empathize with human suffering, it's a dangerous way to go.
I think the lead up to October 7th is such a difficult day for so many people. You can feel it in the air, you can feel it in conversation. And I really hope that people feel like there is space for their own grief, wherever that naturally lies, and that wherever possible, that grief and that empathy can expand to include more and more people. The conversation today started with a story and question about this competition between suffering, or this competition between grief. And I really hope that people feel like it isn't a competition, and that there is enough space to have empathy for all sorts of people at the same time. And for that grief and that mourning to be something that helps push us forward to something better, to an end to the suffering, and a real, political horizon that can lead to safety and freedom and equality for everyone. As we wrap up, I just want to say, we started this conversation with me asking a personal question, and it kind of evolved into self-interest and activism and how to change the society. And, a lot of those things, I think, touched on really, really sensitive topics for people. And I'm sure that when we listen back to this, we might, have said things that we wish we said differently. And I'm sure that people resonated with certain things we said, or felt uncomfortable by certain things. And this is really an imperfect conversation, and that's what we want from this podcast. Please write to us, DM us, give us feedback, ask us questions. We really want to bring you into the conversation and incorporate your questions.
And with that, thank you, Jess, for the conversation and for your question. And we will see you the next episode.
See you soon. This show is produced by Yoshi Fields, and music is from Epidemic Sound. Please like and subscribe wherever you listen. And if you have a question for us, feel free to email us, and we might even bring it into the show. Our email is podcast@standing-together.org. We've also put it in the show notes. We'd really love to hear from you. And if you'd like to support the podcast, feel free to donate to Standing Together. You can find the link in our show notes too.